Hello and welcome to the Good Grief Festival and to this event, the Dead Parent Club. I'm joined by Sarfraz Manzoor, Séamas O'Reilly and Xanthe Barker. I'm Julia Samuel, I'm a psychotherapist and author, and we're going to have a conversation about having parents that die for 30 minutes and then answer your questions for the last 15 minutes. You are the listeners and the community in the Good Grief Festival are such a key part of what we do. We'd love you to make your comments and ask your questions and use the box on the right of your screen. You know, the Dead Parent Club is a club that nobody wants to be a member of. And, you know, any young person or child who's had a parent that dies knows that this isn't something that you just get over, that it is part of you and stays with you all of your life. And it's a way of, it's about how to kind of accommodate or find a way of living with that loss, still finding a way to live again and love again and trust again. And the three people I'm with, I am so delighted to have you because you've written and thought and experienced this both in, you know, completely individual and separate ways. So I'd love you, first of all, to introduce yourself. Sarfraz, introduce yourself and tell us about your parent that's died.
How long do you want us to talk for in this bit?
A couple of minutes, if that's okay.
Okay. So, yeah, hi, everyone. My name is Sarfraz Manzoor. I'm a writer, screenwriter, broadcaster, various other bits and bobs. And yeah, so basically let's take it back to the last Sunday of May, 1995. I'm living in Manchester. I'm 23 years old, unemployed. So I've been bumming around doing a various sort of non-entity kind of jobs, trying to work out what I'm going to do with my life. I'm living in Manchester away from my parents who live in Luton. And life feels pretty good, actually, in many ways, because I'm away from my family. I'm getting a chance to enjoy myself. And I'm also still young enough to not hugely worry about where life's going to take me. And then one Sunday night, I'm at an Indian takeaway, just getting a burger. I come back and one of my housemates goes, "You've got to call home. Something's happened." I call home and I find out that my dad had a heart attack. It was a completely sudden heart attack. He was 62 years old and it came out of nowhere. I couldn't drive, so I rang a friend of mine up who drove me all the way from Manchester to the Luton and Dunstable Hospital. I get there, he's in a coma, and we stay with him for a week. And he eventually died 3 days before I turned 24. And that has been, as I'm sure for everybody else who's experienced something similar, like a sort of a moment where there is life before and there's life after. And so that has been the defining moment in my life. And what's been interesting is that I think in terms of my journalism and in my work, you know, people often talk about, you know, there are the key moments or the key issues that we just return to regardless of, you know, what form we're taking. What are the central questions, or what is that scratch that you're trying to itch? And for me, loss, fathers and sons, the absence of stories, because I don't know so much about him that I never found out because I wasn't curious enough at the time. And then being a father and not being able to give my children the experience of having a grandfather, all of this stuff feels very, very present. And the key thing I found, and I'll just wrap up here, the key thing I've tried to struggle with is how to not let grief destroy, but how in some ways to harness it and make it in something. And so the death of my father is there in my memoir, Greetings from Bury Park, which essentially is a conversation in absence with him. And it's there in Blinded by the Light, which is the film adaptation as well, because it's sort of, it's something which you can live with in some ways, but you can't ever really reconcile yourself to. So it feels raw, it still feels fresh. But I think for me, the challenge has been to how to extract something that's meaningful and purposeful and positive out of that tragedy. And that's what I've tried to do in the years since I've been apart from him.
I mean, I can hear how potent and kind of how raw it is now, despite the years, and that the sort of presence of his absence kind of influences every day. But you don't, as much as it was the defining moment of your life, it feels like you're also saying you don't want that to define you. You want to also live and embrace your life and engage with your life with the shadow of the fact that your dad died.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing I find, I'd be interested to hear from the other two as well, is how I often feel like I am, it's a metaphor, but it's like the idea of skating on thin ice, where it will just suddenly hit me. And I'll give you an example. I was when the film was coming out, I was having to do various junkets.
Tell people the title of the
So
film.
the film was called Blinded by the Light, and it's on
Great
Netflix
film.
if you haven't seen it. And I had to do various junkets, and they were all fairly sort of, a lot of them were quite sort of, fairly banal kind of questions, and it was all pretty sort of, populist sort of stuff. And there was a young lady, and she was asking me some questions like, oh, so why Bruce Springsteen's like, and then she just suddenly said, oh, so what do you think your dad would make of this film? And it was its form was in a very kind of gentle, benign way. And I just completely collapsed in tears. And I couldn't, it was almost like, it wasn't that I was able to just then say something insightful or meaningful. It just destroyed me completely. And it was like very embarrassing. She just had a list of questions she was asking. She didn't realize it was going to happen. And this happens too often, actually. And it happens with my daughter suddenly asking me a question. And so it's just interesting to me how that rawness is unpredictable. I won't know when it might hit me. And you would think that after, 20 something years, there would be some more sort of scar tissue, there would be some hardening over there. But it's amazing how a certain question or a certain thing will just take me back to that absolute level. And the reason is because there's this chasm of grief. And it's not even his absence, but it's the absence of knowledge.
Yeah.
It's the absence of knowledge about him that makes it more painful.
What it represents. So Séamas, tell us about you and also your response to Sarfraz.
Yeah, my experience, certainly in the years since, and certainly in the stuff that I've written about, in my case, my mother, tracks with that quite a bit. So when I was 5, my mother died tragically.
Do you want to say who you are? And
oh, of course, yes.
Yeah.
That's probably pretty important. My name is Séamas O'Reilly. I'm a writer, author now. I've written a memoir about my mum's death called "Did You Hear Mommy Died?" It's kind of there in the title. I'm a very literal person, and I was much younger than Sarfraz. I was just 3 weeks before my 6th birthday. My mum died of breast cancer, and her and my father had 11 kids. So I'm one of 11. We were all aged between the ages of 2 and 17 at the time that she died, and my dad brought us all up by himself in Troubles era Derry, which had its own complications. And I think the way that it affected me most specifically was the absence, as Sarfraz said. That was a big part of it. Growing up, the fact that she wasn't there for all these milestones, and I felt othered from my friends. And worse than that, I felt like I was almost a hex.
Like you brought bad luck, is that what a hex is?
Or yeah, exactly. Or like I would remember being picked up by mums of my friends, and when they would talk about what happened to us, they'd say, they'd bless themselves, which is kind of
like
not,
don't like
yeah, kind of an unthinking thing. But so that in growing up, I had all the standard stuff you'd imagine as a 5-year-old, then to 10-year-old and 15-year-old, and not having my mum around. But we were very lucky that I was brought up with my amazing father, who's kind of the star of the book. But as I got older, it's what Sarfraz said. It's this absence of knowing things. It's the fact that, I've got a kid now, and what he's got a nana and granddad in Dublin from his mum's side, my wife, but he's only just got a granda in Derry, and he hasn't asked about it yet, but pretty soon he will. He kind of thinks that my dad's dog is maybe isn't that his Granny O'Reilly? I'm not sure, because he always mentions them together, and then Nana and Grandad.
They're a couple.
Yeah, it's Nana and Grandad, and then it's Granda and Annie, the puppy. So for me, there is such a chasm of grief. There's so many layers to it, and you can be operating so well within it. In my case, anyway, that I'm writing and writing and writing. I'm telling funny stories and sad stories, and it's not really affecting me. And then literally I can just write something down or have someone say something or receive a message, and it crumbles because the absurdity of death and the horror of it and the mundanity of it is that it's, you know, it's so hard to process. And we can do, you can definitely deal with it better some ways than other ways, but it still has, there's a lot of power to it, and maybe it does take a lifetime to let it all kind of work through.
I mean, what it feels like you're both saying in similar ways is that with the death of your parent, the love for them and wanting to talk to them and wanting them to see your life and be in your life and know more about them, that the relationship continues, the love for them never dies. And there are times that you can just get on and enjoy your day, and times that for no reason, like I know it's the 30th anniversary of your mum's death, so you'd expect it, but it's the unexpected through smells or a comment, a question, like Sarfraz says, that the feeling of missing, the hurt, the rawness of missing them. You don't just build a kind of armor against it. It can just pop up at any time.
No, and like Mother's Day in school became this thing which teachers would be quite scared.
Sensitive. I'm scared of you.
They were scared for me and sensitive, and they would just tiptoe around me. And it just never made any sense to me, because Mother's Day isn't like, it's not like some sort of national holiday of great importance. It doesn't mean anything to me or my mum, our relationship or anything. It was never a tradition that had been established. You know, I couldn't remember Mother's Days or anything. But these very same people who, you know, my friends and stuff, who would like be very shy around me on that day, they would complain about their mums all the time, you know, and they'd say, "Oh, I hate my mum. She won't give me money to go out," or whatever. You know, typical teenage stuff. You know, as I was getting older. And they couldn't see how that was 100 times more offensive.
Yeah,
you know.
like they had a mum to complain about.
Exactly.
And Xanthe, tell us about you and your relationship with, tell us who you are and your relationship with your dad and your book.
My name's Xanthe Barker, and my book, Will This House Last Forever? My relationship with him, and then him dying. And I'm trying to think, I feel like I can relate so much of what you guys have both said, but I guess first of all, my dad was a poet, and he met my mum, and they had a kind of big romantic story and got together and went to Greece, and then had 2 children. But once he'd had a second child, he wasn't really able to cope with the domestic situation anymore. So he left when I was about 4 months old and abandoned my mum, left her in a really awful situation. And then was kind of around for my childhood, but he's very much the kind of absent dad who then turns up and does really exciting things with you and then like leaves again. So I had quite a difficult relationship with him. And then I think probably by the time I was in my early 20s, I felt somehow like I was trying to process a lot of that stuff and building up a relationship with him again. And then at that point, he was starting to seem a bit less not well. And then he was diagnosed with lung cancer and died 6 months later. So one of the things I used to think at the time was like, it just seemed so outrageous that how dare he'd left and then he died. Like, you know, it just seemed like
you lost him twice. You lost him while he was alive. He wasn't a present dad, and then he actually died and fully left you. So it's like a double loss.
Yeah, and what was really confusing is that, you know, he died and the next day I didn't see him, but I thought, well, I never see him. And if 2 weeks later I hadn't seen him, well, I thought that's very normal. I don't see my dad very often. So it took a really long time for me to understand what it even meant, you know, that what dead meant. And that really confused me for a while. So probably the first few years, my whole kind of experience of grief was just thinking that people were crazy. They just kept saying words like dead and kind of trying to explain, you know, almost being patronizing me, like, if you're not going to see him again. And I'd be like, you don't really know what you're talking about. It just seemed like the whole word was nonsensical. As well as that, and I felt like he was talking to me. I felt like he was still alive, and in a lot of ways then he felt much closer to me than he did when he was alive, because suddenly he's like completely accessible. He's like, I can talk to him all day if I want to. and I can ignore the bits that I didn't like. You know, I don't have to listen to him being critical of me or dismissive. Suddenly he's like totally fascinated in me. So a lot of the time I just felt like I found it hard to talk to people, because a lot of the time I was, maybe if other people had parents who died, they had parents who died who they really loved and they really missed them. And I felt like I'd have to pretend that I really loved my dad, because otherwise I wasn't really grieving. So I was sort of playing along.
So confusing.
Yeah, it was very confusing, until eventually when I started writing about it, I thought, I'm just going to write down what I mean. I'm going to say my dad is dead, but he's not really dead. And I made this philosophical argument that actually he wasn't dead. And then I could prove to people that he hadn't died. But it kind of ended up being, when I showed it to people, and then when it was published and then kind of went into a book, I guess that whole process has been much more kind of coming to understand that he has died. Maybe that sounds a bit abstract, but also I maybe was thinking that what Séamas was saying about this idea of being a hex to people. And I mean, I was 25, but not many people I knew's parents had died. And that sense of kind of walking into a room and everybody goes silent, or, you know, someone mentions the word dad and everyone kind of looks around nervously. And you just feel like you've made everyone's day worse. And as my boyfriend at the time as well, I just felt like I'm just causing this awful scene in his life, you know, making him, you know, he has to go to a funeral. He has to watch me like being miserable all the time. And I didn't feel like people had the language to kind of understand it.
I was going to say, I had a sort of slight spin on that experience, because a couple of years after my dad died, my mum and family started sort of encouraging me to start thinking about having an arranged marriage. And, you know, that was not something I particularly wanted anyway. But one of the things that my brother and my mum explained, which sort of made the idea of an arranged marriage even worse, was the fact that I no longer now had a dad made me less appealing as a prospect.
Oh my God.
And so they were like, look, you know, we're not actually going to get the top rank of girls interested in you, because, you know, we don't have a dad. And
you're a sort of dad now.
Yeah. And so basically, you know, we're sort of, you know, we're a dog with three legs to some extent. And so don't expect that you'll be able to get the top rank. Let's get the best we can manage and who'll accept you, which was quite galling, considering it wasn't directly my fault.
But then you talked about when you did decide who you're going to marry, you were kind of wondering about what your dad would have thought.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, because that thing that you just said, Xanthe, about, you know, this idea about, you know, how does one view one's dad? And I think one of the things that often can happen if you lose someone relatively young is, you know, you sort of simplify them to being just, you know, you just remember their positive qualities, and you sort of have a slightly distorted interpretation of them. And that doesn't really help you, and it doesn't really help understanding. But then sometimes that just comes into hard conflict. So when I was thinking, you know, when I got married, when I was going out with the woman who's now my wife, who's, you know, she's white and she's Scottish and she's not Muslim, and I was starting to think about this idea about getting married. And when I started to contemplate what my father would have thought, there was absolutely no world in which I could imagine that he'd have been okay with it. And in fact, in every world, I imagined he would have been completely furious. And not only that, but the hard truth was the fact that he wasn't there actually probably made it easier, because I only had one parent to argue with. But then it slightly sours your experience or your joy or something, because you can't really say, oh, you know what, he's looking down, feeling happy for you, because I couldn't really see a narrative where that was the case.
And also your imagination could have been limitless about what he would say or how angry he'd be, and that could go on forever. Whereas if you actually have a conversation with someone, you get to a point where they've sort of said it and you find a way of living with it.
But also, I think your imagination, there's a sense that people get frozen at a particular point, which means that the idea of growth becomes harder. So you think, well, the person in 1995 may have said those things,
but he could have changed.
And because I've changed, there's no reason why he couldn't have changed. But because you don't see the evolution, you're sort of you're battling against or holding yourself up against a person whose ideas are fixed in, the particular moment that they died. Whereas actually people do evolve, and especially parents evolve when they see their children growing up and wanting to
And
be happy,
happy.
etc. Yeah, but it's hard to get your head around all those because it becomes so speculative that it's hard to kind of hold on to it.
Yeah, I think that happens a little bit as well with me when I think about my mum, who, I mean, she's literally, there's a very beautiful photograph of her which is framed in our sitting room, and that's the picture of her that I have in my head, and that I think most of her family, it was used on the mass cards and the death notice. It's a particularly beautiful shot of her. She's wearing a lovely sort of very 80s sort of pantsuit kind of affair, but she looks really lovely. And she's like this snapshot on the wall. And she's positioned basically in the same part of the wall where in Irish Catholic households, the Virgin Mary would be, or the Sacred Heart. And growing up, I found it very hard to disentangle that kind of iconography from my mother. She was this perfect woman who first of all, she was an amazing woman. She had 11 kids. She was a beloved teacher.
Which was unusual, wasn't it? It was not like every Catholic family. We assume it in Ireland that everybody had 11, 20 kids. Actually,
yeah, in their generation, my parents' generation, even though my father was an only child, so worked that one out. But it would have been relatively more common. But like by the time my age, it was broadly the same as the rest of the UK or Ireland, maybe a bit more, maybe 3 or 4 people were in Ireland. In the UK, maybe it was 1 or 2, but like 6 people would be a massive family. 8 would be frankly ridiculous. 11 is fizzily demented, right? So despite all this, she fostered 6 or 7 kids as well.
Oh my God.
Yeah, she was that person. She was the person about whom you say, oh, no one speaks ill of the dead. But like, really, I was stopped in the streets all the time and told, you don't know me, but you look like your mother. You're Sheila's boy. And they just tell me some lovely thing. But I found that weirdly, as lovely as it is, unfulfilling, because it felt like there was this perfect image of a person who didn't seem real. And it was like trying to relate to a space shuttle or something. And the only time I really felt like I did get that deepness and that sort of touch of the infinite from, beyond the grave or whatever, was when her friends, like my Auntie Patricia and my Auntie Moira, would come in and they would say, she was the biggest suck up that you ever met in school, or she was always ruining the songs because she couldn't remember any of the words, or she couldn't cook to save her life. That sort of stuff made it real.
The minutiae, the kind of little true anecdotes.
Completely, and as well, it seasoned the rest of the dish, because you can't just have someone who's
the saint.
The saint is unrelatable. And growing up, I would be beckoned into those little blasphemous corners where they'd tell me that my mother was perhaps a saint, but also like, a human being. And it made that portrait on the wall that little bit more approachable and something more I could imagine as a person, because I had so few memories of her as a person. I just knew her from all this, pageantry.
What I'm really aware of is that all of you are kind of really nodding at each other, that you are all a member of a club that's nice. I mean, you never want to be a member of, but you can really see yourselves in each other. And there's that sort of feeling of knowing and connection, which it feels very powerful. But I was wondering about your relationship with your surviving parents. How has that changed? And how is that influenced by the fact that your parent died? Xanthe, do you want to? Your mum.
No, my mum, who in my book I think she's a very central part, and I wanted to protect her, so she's not. I mean, I have told a lot of her story, and this is this really awful thing which happened to her, and not my dad dying. I mean him leaving and not being there, and I guess him leaving affected our relationship in a huge way, as it does. If you grow up with a single mum, your mum is everything, but they're under so much stress that it's like a very harsh experience for them, and like financially, emotionally, like everything. And because my dad was so absent, I think that left all of us with a lot of anger towards him. And in some ways, I think when he died, it was kind of this freedom from him. There was this pull and push of kind of, he's around, he's not around, I'm seeing him, I'm not seeing him. It was just like, he's gone, we can kind of make peace with it. I think it was really, my mum was, you know, the grief for her was a lot more momentous than I guess people imagined, because they think, oh, you know, you guys divorced 25 years ago, what's it going to mean to you? But it was really big for her. And I think afterwards and since then, maybe we've been able to be honest with each other in a way which wasn't really possible before. And as well, because my dad's died, I feel really free from his influence, like a bit what Sarfraz was saying. There's this sense that maybe the parent would disapprove of your life, but also the sense that for me that was just a great freedom. I was like, I don't have to try and impress my dad anymore. I don't have to do things that he would want me to do.
Or want him to love me, that kind of
yeah,
needing
exactly.
him,
I don't have to
needing
try
his.
so hard. Which probably made things easier with my mum. I guess, and made us closer in that way, because maybe she could be more honest about the story and parts of the story that she'd been holding back to protect me from before.
And others?
Well, it became more. I think it's a more complicated story, I think, with my mum, because I think one of the things that my mum did immediately kind of after my dad died actually was just a little bit like what Séamas was talking about, is just make my dad seem like the most perfect husband. Like it became kind of like almost fable-like kind of stories of things that he did, that he was always considerate and he always elevated her and this, that, and the other. And I don't know if that's actually helpful. And so it was really hard. First, it was hard to actually get an understanding of who he really was, because she'd sort of blowtorched any kind of bad memories or anything. So I think that made it a little bit tricky in some ways. But the other thing I think it did, which I feel a little bit guilty of, and I've tried to redress a little bit more, more in my recent writing, is it's sort of, because somebody dying is such a massive thing, dramatically and emotionally.
And out of time. I mean,
and out of time. It means that becomes the parent that you sort of spend more time thinking about and focusing on. And so
wanting what you can't have.
Yeah. So, but then in the story of one's life, you sort of start thinking, oh, my dad was the incredible person who did this and he did that. And you sort of end up giving too much attention, which means that you don't necessarily appreciate what the other person did as much, And so with the first book, Reading for Berry Park, it's based on the story of my dad, and I felt guilty afterwards. I thought, my mum has an extraordinary life that she has led in terms of the sacrifices she's made and everything, and I don't feel like I gave it enough attention because of the fact that she's still alive. Whereas because my dad died and because that story ended, I sort of elevated his story. And I think that that's something which I've become more aware of, is that I think we can over elevate the person who's missing and forget how extraordinary the other person may have been in terms of what they've done or what they've offered. But because they've survived, they don't necessarily get that same attention.
I've absolutely taken that approach. I mean, my dad did an amazing job, and we were all very aware of it. But I think I never, until I wrote the book, which is largely about our family at that time, so largely about him, I thought about him as a great dad, and I thought about him as, digging in and raising 11 kids on a single wage. I never thought about that before, as an adult now with a child myself. I'm like, how did you do any of this? Like every single day that my son goes to sleep safely in his bed, I feel like I should get some sort of a knighthood. And I did find that how the hell did he do it 11 times, and how did he keep going? And when I was writing the book, I first started thinking, well, I never actually thought about what it was like for you personally, you to lose the love of your life, for you to lose that person.
Yeah.
All about my own grief and thinking about the practicals, and then at a later, patting myself on the back for considering, what it was like for him to raise us all. But I didn't really think this is a woman that he adored, that he was, fully in love with, who he's never remarried or been with anyone else since. 30 years as of last week. I'm saying that the anniversary was last week. I don't mean that his dating profile I've looked at since last week. And that getting to know him and getting to sort of on those aspects of him, the sort of full picture, and also turning him into a bit of a cartoon because he is a ridiculous man in ways. That's been the most.
Where you get your humor from there?
I mean, I get a different. Okay, let's say that. My dad's not necessarily a very funny man. My dad only knows one joke, but it's very, very good, which is where he reverses the car and he says, "Oh, this takes me back." That's it. I've never learned to drive, and the only thing.
Sarfraz, that really works.
That is a good joke. That is a very good joke.
You only need one if it's that good. But I completely know what Sarfraz means, because he was surrounded by pictures of his beloved wife, and he would be probably slightly less outgoing even than my mum was. So a lot of their friends were her friends, and they treated him like, very, very well, but also like a bit of a pity case maybe sometimes. Of course, how could you not? He's got 11 kids. He's 44 and he has 11 kids and he's a widower and he's got one job, and we don't have loads of money or anything. We're just,
during the Troubles, like people being blown up, and
during the Troubles, 1991, you're still like 2 years
in
before
war. You're in the war.
2 years before that, 26 months before that, a bomb had gone off 20 feet from our house, literally in front of our house, the building right in front of our field. So like, there's loads of this stuff going on.
Trauma, all that trauma.
So much trauma. And at a time when you didn't really talk about things, my dad somehow managed to train himself to be able to do that. So one of the best things I can say about him is that he was able to talk to us about emotions. He was able to talk to us about grief, and we were encouraged to talk to each other about grief. And part of that was, but he has a very strong faith, one I don't necessarily have myself, but he has a very strong Catholic, but much more the sort of like the folk tradition of Catholicism, very about family and reconciliation and all that stuff. But it meant that we grew up talking about this stuff and actually did get through a lot of that stuff at a younger age than maybe other people might have done.
So one of the kind of comments that we're getting from our lovely audience is, once you know that a parent, that someone that you love can die, you can't not know that the other parent can die. Also that death happens, that that you are mortal and that the people you're closest to you are mortal. And what they're talking about is a kind of sense of anxiety about death and dying. And you saying you're tucking up your son, you deserve a kind of medal, but also I guess there's a fear that you're going to do to him what your mum did to you. I don't know if any of you've all got children, so
yeah, that's something which is absolutely a massive part of my life, actually. And there are two manifestations of that. One is that I've talked before that I have so little information about my dad, and I think that is directly why I have kept a diary since I was 9. But then I've since, like in the last sort of 15-20 years, it's pretty pathological, and it's why so much of my journalism is sort of first person, and I just keep so much stuff.
For your daughter?
It's basically a paper trail, for my little boy and so that if something was to happen, I have got so much material that they would be able to understand a little bit of who I am.
She can find you.
Yeah,
in absence.
That's one thing. But the second thing, which is not healthy in any way whatsoever, is because my dad died at 62. I am, largely convinced that I'm 50 now. I'm largely convinced I've got 12 years left.
That's your line.
Yeah. And it's not a sort of a jokey kind of thing. That is how I sort of see in terms of how I'm going to get much done and everything up. And my brother, who is 59, he has already said, well, if I make it beyond 62, it's good. It's great. But I'm basically assuming that I've got to get everything done up to that point, and then everything else is a bonus. And this idea of the finishing line, and because it was not random, but because it just happened out of nowhere, it means that I just think, well, how do I know that my genetic cards are not dealt that way? That regardless of the fact that obviously we've got better health and we can be better fit, we can be more fitter, and we can have more medicine and things. How do we know that the genetic cards are not just dealt, that is just your lot, And I still have that I'm more likely to believe that on any given day than not, which then makes you think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this time that I've got left? So that definitely, both those things are very, very clear and present in my life.
It makes me think that about probably my response is just to constantly rehearse like disaster situations at all times. I think, okay, this is my death playing out. What would happen? What do I need to have in place? This is my kind of the father of my child's death playing out. What would happen? What would I do? What would be the next step? This is my mom's death. And even if it feels really morbid, it feels like
preparing yourself.
yeah, going through those stages and what would happen in the thing. It feels like some way of kind of, I guess, having just being prepared for it.
It's sort of warding off the hoodoo by saying the thing all again.
Yeah, because if you give yourself the trust that you're going to be okay, the gods will come down and knock you off your perch. That thing.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a way of thinking about it. It's like never imagining that you're safe in case the kind of the gods come and knock you back.
I mean, every client I've ever had thinks they're going to die at the time or the age that their parent died. So it's very, very common for us.
Yeah.
So I've got another question. Did your siblings deal with the death of your parent differently? How did it affect your relationships with your siblings?
I suppose I can answer this one as quickly.
You've got a lot of them, boy.
I've got 10 siblings. It's completely changed everything about our entire lives, to the point where, as Sarfraz was saying earlier, I find it almost impossible to imagine a future hypothetical of what they would be doing now or what they'd be thinking now, what my mum would be doing. But I find we would be completely different people. I mean, so drastically.
It changed you all.
Yeah,
but you must have all felt it differently. I mean, when I work with families, everyone, you can all have been in the same room when she died, and you'd have had a different story and a different way of expressing it and experiencing it. And you maybe fight for your story, or did you all allow each other to have your own truth, your own experience, your own memory?
Yes, there was definitely a battle for that. Hence my book.
So have you won the battle now because you're in print?
Yes. Well, no, I'm teasing my family there. No, it's one of those things where even when I was writing the book, everyone has completely different memories. So the call that came from my dad went to Belfast to the hospital where my mum was during the very worst last stages of her cancer, and they rang him at like 3 a.m. and said, "Look, come." He thinks that she might already have died at that stage, and they were just, he went there and he had to call back to the house and say, "Tell us." And we don't even remember, half the people, I don't remember, I'm too young, but half of them remember, Dara picked up the phone. The other half swear, but I know it was Sinead. Dara doesn't even know. I mean, that's got to be the most momentous thing that's ever happened to you. So memory can make it difficult to talk about these things. But also the fact that we grew up and were shaped so fully by having that death being something very sad about, then also just having one parent that we could manipulate and sort of have, who was also himself going through basically
his own loss.
But also how I was 5, so I had a completely different loss to a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old. So it's only really been as we've all gotten older and gotten to know each other as adults that we've kind of picked apart some of those finer, messier details. And now we're very open in talking about it, not least because I've made a massive WhatsApp thread for the last 3 years to write the bloody book. So it's just people just stick in things. I started just doing it like, "Hey, do you remember we went on that holiday somewhere and someone was choking or something?" And then you get 200 replies all arguing about the facts. But now people just put in, "Oh, I just found this picture of Mummy," or "Did you?" So yeah, it's nice.
It's quite interesting because I've got an older brother and an older sister who are 9 and 10 years older, and then I've got a younger sister, and so there's a hierarchy because my older brother
they had them longer than
they had them longer, but they just have more memories. But the other thing that's really interesting is, you just mentioned about you can be in the same room and have different experiences. So I am somebody who's always been interested in story and memories and thinking about stuff, and I've got an older brother who's just the most unreflective person on the planet, and so I sort of think, have you really done the work? Have you properly grieved? That is just not his vocabulary at all. And that's fine. And that's just the way he is. But one of the things one of the sort of downsides for me is that he's sort of almost sort of pathologically unsentimental. So soon after, like within weeks of my dad dying, he literally repainted everything that was in the house. He just emptied out everything, threw everything out.
Oh no.
And so all the sort of relics and mementos, which
oh my God,
a huge amount to me.
Yes.
His way of, I imagine the way I can sort of deal with it is his way of processing grief was to just throw everything out.
Forget and move on. And yours was to remember, and
mine was to remember
and connect.
Exactly. And so we're so different. He really just absolutely just literally set everything on fire, metaphorically. And so I'm just like, this stuff was the precious things of back in the day.
touchstones to your dad's memory. And
Yeah,
he
so
was
it's
like,
just-
what I look at, I don't want that. I need to get rid of it.
Yeah.
How did you react when you saw this, when you walked into the room for the first time and saw that it was all?
I mean, the only way I can describe it is it's like a second death. You know,
Yes.
it's like,
Yeah, completely.
you know, you just think these things existed that were part, you know, your clothes,
The smell
or
of
this,
him, that
the smell of him or something.
Mhm.
And so it's a very, I mean, to be honest, I try not to even think about it because it's so, it hurts me
Upsetting.
so much to think that is how somebody deals with their loss, is to just get rid of everything. And the only way
And I mean, it is so different. And of course, it is legitimate. I mean, there are many people that do that, but the feeling is that they're completely wrong.
Yeah,
So,
because I just sort of think I think the thing is, it'd be interesting to hear what you think about this. I think he's one of these people who just thinks you just bury things indefinitely, and then you just, you know, the sort of Trump-like figure actually, where you just think, I'm just going to deny reality and just get through to the end, and everyone else can pick up the pieces, you know. And maybe that is a way of dealing with it, but it's not the way that I necessarily do. So that's a very interesting contrast.
and Xanthe, your brother.
It was making me think of my older brother, who, especially when my dad was ill and I was really kind of wanting to feel it and think about it and kind of losing my mind. And I remember ringing my brother one day to say, you know, have you heard this new awful thing that's happening to my dad? And he just said, he got really angry with me. He's like, why are you telling me this? I don't want to know, you know. And when I got upset, he said, look, I'm just not going to be the kind of big brother that you want. I'm sorry, I'm not in that kind of place. And even afterwards, for a long time, he would say that he didn't really feel sad and he didn't know why I felt sad, and you know, all those kind of negative things about our dad had got in the way much more for him. So it took him much longer. But now we talk about it a bit more, but yeah, we were on completely different planes for a good few years, and still are in many ways now. But we just had such a different relationship, and I guess so much of grief is defined by your relationship to a person in the first place.
And we're coming up to the end, and it feels, I mean, it's just the beginning of a really deep and incredibly meaningful conversation between all of you. And for everyone listening, your kind of honesty and the way that you can voice what you feel and how you've brought your parents into the room with us is so powerful.
And am I right in saying that we're all going to get free counselling afterwards as a result of
yes, you got me free for 10 sessions. That's
well, actually, I heard that it was going to be like the old Dennis the Menace Club, where you get like a little badge, and a binder, Dead Parent Club, all branded, pencil case, the whole thing.
And you have the pencil case, the Dead Parent Club, and the picture of days the dead people.
And then it's the goggly eyes like Nasher. So.
Definitely. But for everyone that's listening and engaged with you, read their books. For some reason, Sarfraz, I don't have your book, but have you got a copy of your book?
I will take that personally.
You do take it personally. I don't know why I haven't, but they can watch your film. And where can everybody find you if they want to have a further conversation with you? Each of you just quickly say where
I'm on Twitter, so you can just find me on Twitter.
Same here. I'm Shopgraph Beats on Twitter.
And you're on Instagram, aren't you?
I am very, very small.
I'm on Instagram as well.
You're on Instagram.
Yeah.
I'm not on Twitter, but I'm on Instagram. But you have to come to my house if you want to speak to me.
And I'm on Instagram too. So thank you so much, everybody. It does feel like the relationship with your parents is so powerful, and you've made it so powerful through the work that you've done, and that you've helped people understand themselves when they've had a parent that dies. But also it feels like such an incredibly important legacy and relationship for yourself and for your families, that you've worked through and faced what you feel in the very different ways that you've each done it. And I really kind of take my hat off to you and thank you for having this conversation with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thanks to both of you.